Dr. BlackDeer is a queer decolonial scholar activist from the Southern Cheyenne Nation and serves as an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. Her scholarship illuminates the impact of structural violence on American Indian and Alaskan Native communities. Dr. BlackDeer centers Indigenous voices throughout her research, using quantitative approaches and big data as tools for responsible storytelling. Dr. BlackDeer is a racial equity scholar with an emphasis on Indigenous tribal sovereignty and is deeply committed to furthering decolonial and abolitionist work. Thank you, Dr. BlackDeer, for joining us. It's really cool to have you here. I know I'm personally really excited about it. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Today, we're going to share some space talking about decolonization and how we can actually apply decolonial scholarship in our framing of thinking about racial trauma and shifting our conversation towards healing. So I might say good morning because it's morning time over here in Denver. It's about 10:30. So I also just always say good morning to people whenever I see them as well, like no matter what time of day it is. So good morning. So let's kind of frame where we're headed for today. So we'll start with the agenda introductions, which is what we're doing right now. We'll have a brief overview of what racial trauma is, a lot of the terms that are deployed to understand what that is, where that kind of confusion comes in. And then we'll kind of shift to talking about what decolonization actually is. So if you're familiar with my work on decolonization, we'll kind of talk about how this is more of an applied approach to looking at decolonial scholarship, and how this can really impact our clinical practice, right? And so that'll be our kind of third objective for today, is talking about pathways to healing and where we can actually meaningfully integrate this into our work and our scholarship going forward. And then we'll have time at the end for Q&A, okay? So thanks so much for being here today. Like Sydney introduced me, I'm Asher BlackDeer. I use she, her pronouns. This word right here is an assist us, which means I am Cheyenne, or we are Cheyenne people. So I am a member of the Southern Cheyenne Nation. We are based out of Western Oklahoma. Denver is actually the traditional homelands of my tribe before we split. So we started out in Denver, and then the Northern Cheyenne went up. And Southern Cheyenne obviously went down to Oklahoma, and we are allied here with the Arapaho Nation. So I am an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Social Work here at the University of Denver. I'm finishing up my first year, yay! So we're making it, we're out here. And yeah, like Sydney said, I really describe myself as a decolonial scholar activist. So it's kind of a weird place to navigate being within the academy as an Indigenous person, as someone who has been displaced by the university to try to navigate these colonial systems. So decolonization has really provided me a pathway to find my way in these spaces and to also work to reclaim these spaces as I navigate them as I go through. So yeah, if you have questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat throughout, and then I'll answer them at the end, or if you just want to hang on to them till the end, I'll answer them for sure. Just whatever works for you. Some folks are like, I have to write this down because I'm going to have another question later. Totally fine, but I will not be responding to the chat until we get to the Q&A portion, okay? Alrighty. So before we get started, just a note, talking about trauma, talking about especially racial trauma or incidents of, oppression and structural violence can be an intense topic. And so I feel like another, kind of thing that we have normalized in the academy is that we just talk about folks' experiences as if there are not people who have lived experiences in the room. And so I just wanted to name that and recognize that, like, the things that we're talking about are not abstracted from our lived experiences as people. So just kind of take a moment to be aware of things that might cause some, activation for you, right? So maybe feeling overwhelmed, angry, anxious. Sometimes folks kind of tend to drift off, like maybe you're daydreaming. That might be a sign that you're trying to kind of numb some things that are coming up. And so I just want to invite you all to take care of yourselves as we're talking about trauma and racial trauma and decolonization, to really take care of yourself and one another. So if it becomes too activating for you, maybe you take some time and come back to this later, right? Maybe you watch the recording afterwards. Maybe you go outside and, reconnect with the earth or take some deep breaths or things like that. Maybe you don't come back to this. Maybe you're like, this is not where I'm at right now. Totally fine. We hold space for wherever folks are at on their journeys. And so I just wanted to invite folks to, really tune in with yourself, because this is, again, like, we have to interrupt these systems of like pushing through our trauma and our pain just to perform as academics, right? So the invitation here, it won't hurt my feelings at all if you need to hop off, or do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, okay? So let's get going thinking about racial trauma and what we're actually talking about. So trauma is one of those huge topics, I think, that shows up everywhere, especially since we've been living through a massive global pandemic for the past 3 years now, going on 4. And so I think folks have just now started to kind of really reckon with the fact that a lot of the ways that our lives have changed, right? And so, even thinking about post-pandemic or wherever we're at now, the conversation around trauma is only getting stronger, right? Um, we can see you cannot open social media, you cannot look at the news daily without seeing some form of normalized trauma that we're just supposed to be okay with, right? So the ongoing state-sanctioned violence, specifically police brutality against Black people, the movement for Black lives has brought about a lot of social change that folks are now actually trying to reckon with structural issues, right? The ongoing conversations about gun violence, trauma for children and teachers and everyone that's involved in these sorts of mass shootings, right? So ongoing, we're talking about trauma as this sort of societal level experience, right? And before, folks really only talked about trauma as like maybe folks who came back from war or, experiencing domestic violence, right? As this kind of individualized experience. But more and more, every day we're experiencing being exposed to witnessing folks experience trauma at a societal level, at a collective experience, right? And so we want to kind of shift our focus today to thinking about that level of trauma, rather than, the historic kind of like individual experience of trauma. We're thinking collectively today. So there's lots of been definitions that have been deployed throughout time, right? So Erickson originally said trauma is wounds and our reaction to wounds. Gabor Mate talks about, trauma isn't what happens to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. And then Resmaa Menakem also talks about, trauma is a response to anything overwhelming that lives in the body, right? So thinking about anything that happened to us too much or for too long or at an unattainable frequency, right? And so thinking about this, it's kind of like these definitions are even inviting us to think about there is this broader experience of trauma that's not really the incident itself, it's really how we respond to it, right? Or how that's experienced and interpreted by ourselves. So for us today, I want us to think about trauma as this sort of macro level phenomenon, right? So we're going to talk about structural processes of history, but also how those structural processes inform today's experiences of social systems, right? And so this trauma can be carried in our bodies, our minds, and our spirits, right? When we start talking about decolonization, we'll talk about how, Western conceptions of the self separate, the mind versus the body, or even how folks talk about embodied experiences as merely physical when it's not necessarily. And so the invitation here is to think that, really interrogate, how do I think about trauma? Do I really think trauma is in the mind, right? Or, everyone's favorite book, right? The Body Keeps the Score. Like, has anyone thought about asking the body to not keep the score? So thinking about, we're having these conversations here and there and piecemeal, but what does it actually mean to think about trauma at a multi-level experience, right? As a collective experience, as not just something that resides inside our minds, or not something that's solely in our body that we just physically respond to. Like, how can we hold multiple truths at once, right? That's also an exercise of decolonization. So I just invite you all along with me on this journey today. So thinking about all of the different categories of trauma, right? So somatic, medicalized, psychological, all of the things, right? And there's a lot of different definitions, and a lot of these kind of overlap, kind of have pieces from other places, right? And it really depends on who you're asking, what the setting is, why would we consider that in the first place, right? So the first column is really these sort of like predominantly biomedical experiences of trauma, right? Um, how that's categorized for folks in the medical field. When we start thinking about time or collective experiences, we kind of get into the middle category, right? So we can't have structural level trauma without acknowledging the societal structures that are in place that have been remnants of colonialism, right? Um, Collective trauma has been put forth a little bit, but I think it's kind of under theorized, or maybe it's too broadly applied to folks that it's kind of lost its meaning. And then of course we we're all in social work, right? Or we're social work adjacent by being here. Vicarious trauma was like the thing for the longest time, right? Like we were talking about first responders, we were talking about social workers, right? That's where the kind of the self-care discourse emerged from as well. Um, but in all of these things, and I know historical trauma had its moment for a time as well, but we'll talk about how these concepts are really not getting at what we need to talk about today, and how this is actually playing out for all of us, not just people in Black and brown bodies, but like everyone. Everyone has experienced racialization by living within the context that we are in today. And so just because we're talking about racial trauma, folks inherently assume that we're only talking about people of color, but that's not the case. So white folks still have a role in healing from and recognizing and working through racial trauma. So we'll talk about all of that stuff today. So where we're really getting to is that colonialism and white supremacy and living under these regimes of, colonial matrix of power, is inherently traumatizing, and not this individual experience of like trauma. It's a collective societal level trauma, right? And a lot of times folks think that trauma is just one instance, but how do we actually encapsulate trauma that happens on an ongoing daily basis at a cumulative sort of effect as well, right? Um, so, a lot of interventions for trauma say like, oh, well, I just need to be able to recognize the trigger, respond to the event, and bring myself back down to baseline. But for folks experiencing racism, colonialism every single day, there really isn't a break line for you to experience a thing, come back down, experience a thing, come back down, right? Because every time I experience something, it's adding on to the other things I've already experienced, right? So trauma itself as a concept is already not getting at all of these things, right? Folks really fail to realize how trauma is actually rooted in all of these policies of racism, sexism, classism, right? That are perpetuated by these systems of power, right? And so a lot of conversations around trauma or trauma responsive organizations or trauma informed care are really just kind of guidelines to say like, we just want folks to not have to tell us what happened to them, right? So trauma informed became this buzzword of like, our organization or our agency will be trauma informed as long as folks can live with their trauma, but they don't have to really tell us about it, right? And so it really became this mechanism of saying, your trauma is fine, we don't have to know about it, right? And so that really further marginalizes folks that are already dealing with societal level traumas, from saying like, oh, well, we're just not going to talk about that, right? Specifically racial trauma, despite the nation's longstanding history, since the nation began, racism has been happening, colonialism has been happening. But despite all of this, however long this nation has been a nation, racism really wasn't even considered a trauma until the early 2000s, right? Um, so racism, and even saying racism, a lot of times people are like, let's talk about microaggressions. Let's talk about implicit bias. Like, we don't want to call it racism, like, let's talk about like diet racism, not like full on racism. We're talking about racism today. We're talking about societal level oppression against Black and brown communities, right? So racism itself is a highly prevalent ongoing source of stress, right? um it's potentially traumatizing. I don't want to say that everybody who experiences racism is traumatized, because we know that folks respond to things differently. Um, I would also venture to say that even the concept of trauma is not interpreted the same way by marginalized communities, right? So even when we think about concepts like anxiety or depression, right, a lot of Indigenous communities don't have a word for that in our languages. I would venture to say that a lot probably don't have something for the idea of trauma, right? Or they would call it something else. Um, so anyways, this current and historic legacy of racism can be described as like a daily group trauma, right? So again, it's a collective experience, it's an ongoing thing. And so I think this is why it's often left out of the trauma discourse, because it doesn't fit that like one-time event and now I'm supposed to heal from it, right? It's like, what do you do about this on an ongoing basis? Because literally the like entire society that we live in does not give a crap about Black and brown communities, right? Um, so what are we supposed to do about that, right? Um, so when we think about it, racial trauma has been described again as all of the things, right? So folks are like, how do you know you experience racism? Um, there's a lot of different things that folks have deployed to try to measure it over time, right? So it could be related to being threatened, experiencing prejudice, actual harm, shame, humiliation, guilt, right? All the things associated with racial discrimination. And again, that kind of vicarious option is in there as well, either experienced directly or witnessed, right? Because we know, like, seeing state sanctioned violence, opening up the news and seeing another, you know, X incident of whatever, like it impacts you, right? We know this. You don't have to directly experience it, spatially, like especially for racially motivated attacks, right? Um, so racial trauma can result in the actual sort of similar manifestations of trauma that we see in those like individual level trauma. So like hypervigilance, avoidance, anxiety disorders, cardiovascular problems, sleep disturbances, right? Um, so some folks have said like, what we should do is really get racial trauma to fit within the context of PTSD, right? That will make everything much more easier. We'll just like put it in the DSM. If you are familiar with me at all, I'm not a fan of the DSM. And so thinking about that, it's really not just a matter of diagnostic criteria, right? What about all of the other things that aren't even counted within what counts as trauma, right? And so thinking about folks have put forth all of these different terms, right? Racist incident-based trauma, racism-based trauma, ethno-violence, racial-based stress, racial-based trauma, race-based traumatic stress, right? Like all of the things together, pieces, I don't know, are all instances, I would argue, of racial trauma, right? And so this is again where folks are like, well, what about the other concepts that we've put forth and how does racial trauma relate to that? So like, is racial trauma the same thing as experiencing microaggressions or stereotype threat or the experience of racial oppression overall, right? And so the idea here is that we have to first, like, it's also Western ways of knowing that want us to like categorize things and put everybody into little boxes, right? And so for me, my brain does not think that way. I don't want to do that. So the idea here, we're already decolonizing, is because we're thinking expansively about what do we count as racial trauma? What are we including within our little criteria, right? And so for me, I'm not as concerned with what's the definition, what encapsulates that, what counts versus what doesn't. I'm trying to understand or get folks to understand that like we have to be more expansive and more accepting of what racial trauma is rather than just trying to find these little checkbox things to say it exists or it doesn't, right? So this is the same thing with microaggressions, right? It only counts if it's visible. That's not true, right? We know that a lot of like racist stuff happens because folks know how to float just under the level of like what can be reported, right? Um, and this again is also like it's literally built into the society, like it's built into the structure. That's why we say like it's systemic or structural racism, because you could take all of the people out, but the system would continue to function and still systematically harm Black and Brown communities because the system is functioning exactly how it was designed, right? Um, so again, we're not looking for trying to find that one quantifiable thing or that one easily visible thing to say, yes, you have experienced racial trauma or not. The idea here is that we need to be aware. And first, it starts with being able to just talk about racism, right? Which we know a lot of folks can't do. We want to talk about how racial trauma impacts not only Black and Brown people, but also white folks as well. So that's where we're heading. So again, this is where we get into thinking about the norms of white supremacy pervade professional and individual conscience, right? So we can get into things like respectability politics, professionalism. Everyone loves to talk about white privilege and white feelings, right? And it's like, no, that's the easily visible stuff that you're like, oh, well, I'm just going to check my privilege and then maybe we can talk about microaggressions. Like, no, we are going to say like, this is a white supremacist system, period. The way that we're operating within the system can pretty much haphazardly perpetuate colonialism and white supremacy. So what we need to do is really get comfortable with saying and talking about what racial trauma is, how that impacts our clients, how that is impacting our organization as a whole, right? So we know that like the majority of clinicians are ill-equipped to address racial trauma or even address racial topics within session. I would also venture to say that the majority of academics are ill-equipped to address racism or racial trauma or even discuss racial topics, right? It's very like, we can have a secret meeting about that in the closed session so no one will get canceled, right? No, that's part of building community and decolonizing what we're actually doing. So we know that trauma itself is hugely underreported. So we know that racial trauma specifically, like who would we report that to? That's not a solution, right? Just reporting instances of microaggressions or experiences of trauma, like as a person of color in a workplace, like I'll probably just be referred to HR, right? Or they'll say like, you need to use those free sessions and work on that yourself, right? So me even talking about experiencing racial trauma within an organization, the organization is going to treat me as the problem, right? So asking folks to just keep reporting or to start reporting is not a solution, right? So after all of that, lovely lighthearted content, let's talk about decolonization, right? So thinking about, continuing our invitation to think expansively, right? We have to first name and address colonialism and coloniality, right? And so in order to disrupt them, we have to explicitly name them. That's why I've been explicitly saying racism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, right? So when we think about who's doing trauma research and who are the key voices here, right? It's very few people of color, right? And even if it is people of color, decolonization is not just adding in brown people to say the same things that white people are saying. Decolonization, we'll get to in a second. So thinking about it, what we're seeing more and more is that folks are just perpetuating this like white dominant colonial perspective, right? And so that inherently privileges things that are visible and quantifiable, those check boxes that we were talking about earlier, right? And so we are not seeing, if we only use this one Western lens, we will continually miss these systemic racial inequalities, right? And so thinking about how we can actually see colonialism, right? Colonialism is an ongoing system of power and not just a historic event. And so a lot of folks are like, why are we talking about colonialism? It's 2023. Coloniality actually allows us to see that through these sort of like interrogating these long-term systems of power and how really society has been laid out as a result of colonialism, right? So maybe the the colonial time period has ended, but the way and the lasting impacts of how they set up society and how things are going still perpetuate through culture, labor, and knowledge production. So there's a colonial matrix of power. There's a few other arms, but we'll just talk about three for today. Um, so there's the coloniality of power, being, and knowledge, and all of these systems work together to reinforce one another. And so it's essentially, if you think about the coloniality of power, that really is where we see white supremacy, racial capitalism, those sorts of manifestations, right? So they concentrated capital and power geographically and socially within Europe, right? And so that then became the center of the capitalist economy, right? So we can still see this today manifested as, you know, Eurocentricity throughout everything that we do. The modeling of our justice systems after certain systems over there, right? Um, so then thinking about how that perpetuates into being, how do we even talk about how colonialism has impacted our experience in life, right? Um, so when we think about it in terms of trauma, we're often pathologized away, right? So this is kind of said like, oh, that's historical trauma, that's cultural trauma, right? And folks just kind of like set that aside, like that's something for y'all to do on your own time. Thank you, goodbye. So again, we're really not considering trauma at the systemic level that it's happening. And then the coloniality of knowledge then is where we see again these powers of being and and knowing into what we count as like what actually counts as knowledge, right? So this again diverts attention away from those systemic sources of trauma, privileges Eurocentric knowledge. So again, if I can't see it, if I can't measure it, if I can't count it, it doesn't count, right? Um, this also is the foundation of those deficit-based trauma narratives, right? So what's wrong with you? What, or, you know, they're saying trauma-informed care changed it from like, what's wrong with you to what happened to you? But I'm like, you're still asking about a negative experience, right? Instead of just saying like, what can we do to help, you know? Which we can talk about that another time because I have a whole tangent on what happened to you. But so if we're thinking about coloniality, I'll spare you all, you know, the full interrogation of colonial matrix of power. But if we think about colonialism synonymous with trauma, then our conversation can then shift from using decolonization as a way to focus on healing, right? So decolonization gets lost in all the buzzwordification of our, you know, our time, right? So DEI, whatever, has like ruined my life and makes me take a lot of time to just say this is not decolonization actually. So fundamentally for our time together, decolonization is essentially undoing colonialism, right? Decolonize. It's the process where a nation reestablishes itself. So this can include returning to traditional ways of being, knowing, such as, you know, privileging our traditional practices and languages, right? That generational wisdom. It can include addressing your own internalized oppression and colonization, right? So all of that lateral violence, internal colonizer stuff, right? So I like to say you can abolish your inner cop, but you also need to like exercise your inner colonizer, right? So the logical endpoint of decolonization would be dismantling these structures and systems of harm, right? So folks have described decolonization as revealing and dismantling colonial power in all of its forms, including the hidden aspects of the institution and cultural forces that have maintained this power and remained even after political independence, right? So a lot of folks think that decolonization is just if Native people do DEI. No. A lot of folks think that decolonization is just like if we have Black and brown people talking about stuff, that counts as decolonizing, right? But we have to get to where something is structurally changed, fundamentally changed, right? And so instead of being prescriptive and, you know, counting symptoms and doing these sorts of things, decolonization is quite the opposite. It's really expansive. And folks get uncomfortable with that as well, right? Because it's like, it's back to you, Jib, you know, like you have to sort through these things. And so we're all in different places along our decolonial journey. So if you're just starting out, welcome, drink the Kool-Aid, it's great. If you're further along and you're like, this is my jam, this is more of an application of how we can actually use decolonization to not only shift our conversations at a structural level, but to also really think about what this can look like in clinical practice. And I also, because I'm an academic, would also venture to say how we can actually shift the academic cultures that we're all within as well, if you are an academic. And if you are, I'll pray for you as well. So let's talk about pathways to healing, right? So looking at shifting our focus towards healing, we can think about using decolonization as helping us to really restore our cultural tools, perspectives, and worldviews, right? And so again, like one of our huge things of decolonization is reclaiming our traditional ways of knowing and being. And so a lot of things colonialism interrupted, a lot of practices went to sleep. But like my elders always tell us, we can awaken that knowledge again. It's not lost, it's not dead, it's just asleep right now. Um, so we're working on waking those things up. So we know that cultures have a long standing history of healing, right? This is not specific to a certain culture, right? So thinking about healing, there is a lot of foundational work in Black feminist praxis, right? Um, there's a lot of focus on healing in Indigenous communities, right? We have traditional healers, right? That's literally what we call them. Um, so thinking about this, it's really one, the invitation to invite folks to reconnect with who they are, where they come from, right? Learning about your own culture, what your ancestors learned, how they viewed the world, right? And this again is decolonizing because it's recognizing that there are other ways of knowing and being outside of this Western white colonial framework, right? Um, Shifting towards healing helps us to affirm and restore wellness, both at our individual levels, but as for the collective as well. And so, one tenet of Indigenous perspectives is that we are a collectivist culture. So, we focus more on interdependence, right? Collective well being rather than independence like the US, right? Like bootstraps and everything else. And ultimately, we're trying to shift this focus of resistance and thriving in the face of colonialism and white supremacy. So a lot of folks are like, um, what happened to you? Right? How could we, instead of just saying, like, let's just address this, as a very transactional approach, um, focusing on healing through a decolonial perspective really allows us to see that our ancestors have really have done this before, right? They've thrived in the face of colonialism and white supremacy, and so we can too. And a lot of times I think whenever folks think about trauma and they're like, oh, I just need to do some trauma work, do some interventions, whatever, and then get back to baseline. That's not the goal here, right? Like we're focusing on that active resistance to ongoing colonialism and white supremacy. Like that is healing, right? Um, think about, Marsha Johnson throwing that brick through the window. Like that sounds healing to me, right? Um, so just expanding our view, I think so getting into, let's take a moment about healing, right? For me, we just have to name the elephant in the room because a lot of times folks are like, the TikTok girlies and the wellness people are all like healing, and it's like, okay, we can also reclaim that, right? So let's just acknowledge that having the time or space and access to do healing work is often seen as a luxury or a privilege, right? In between me navigating systemic poverty, trying to get all my kids to school, making sure that my family back home is okay, sure, let me just take some time and work on healing really quick, right? um Understandably so. So let's just take a moment to think, what do you actually, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of healing, right? um or if you were thinking about doing healing work, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And you're like, it's not all candles and bubble baths. It could be, again, it could be throwing bricks, right? We don't know. It could be, community organizing. It could be, I talk a lot about healing in community, right? Um, Sharing space with folks. What does that actually look like? What do you want it to look like? Um, so thinking about how can we So knowing and holding that space for folks that are like, I don't have capacity for healing right now, how can we then, being a part of community and being in this collective approach, how can we carve out space as we have greater capacity to then help move this paradigm shift so that they will have capacity um, going forward, right? Um, so it's not like a, oh, sorry if you don't have time to heal. This presentation isn't for you, right? It's for all of us, right? To think about how are we going to shift the paradigm? How are we going to move towards actually embodying decolonization and actually, moving to shift these overall discussions, right? So I know personally, I've been held and supported a lot by folks just holding space for me whenever I was at that like no capacity, like barely remember my own name these days, there's a lot of folks that have held the space for me. So I know it's possible to say, like, it's not just transactional, right? It's a reciprocal way of being in the world, of saying, like, this is how we hold the space, this is how we take care of our community, and this is how we focus on making on making life tenable, right? Like, what a concept. Um, so I kind of jumped the gun a little bit thinking about, so the first idea here, let's talk about just the collective responsibility, right? So like I've said before, it's not just for Black and Brown people. White folks are not exempt from doing racial healing work, right? So a lot of folks can do the work, right? Thinking about how can you develop a critical consciousness around whiteness, right? Around the power and privilege that you hold, right? Um, Notice nowhere in here am I asking you to be an ally, right? You can tell I'm very anti-DEI. But thinking about how do we hold the space, right? How are we actually, this is how we change our systems, right? This is how we build community. Um, so if you're doing the work, right, holding space doesn't really seek to fix others, right? Like no one's ever came to me and said, like, this is what we got to do, this is what we're doing. Like, there's this really great quote that's always stuck with me that says, like, a healer isn't someone who like seeks to fix others, they hold the space while the person heals themselves, right? And that's always been like my goal, right? So thinking about, I'm trying to hold space for you all today to even think about these concepts overall, right? We hold space for our students whenever we teach classes and kind of steward them along their journeys. If we are clinicians, we hold space for our clients to then do this work for themselves, right? Um, a lot of us hold space for our families while they are working through some stuff, and it's like, get it together. But we love them. It's great. We'll continue to help them as well. So thinking about it, we've all been impacted by colonialism. So it's the responsibility of all of us to decolonize, right? So again, this is not Black and Brown people doing the work for everyone else again. Um, it really is shifting that perspective to, we are a community, right? And even if, everybody that's on this call right now, we're our own online community right now. If you're watching the recording in the future, we welcome you into our community, right? So a lot of these things, folks are kind of not used to thinking of them in that way because it's not bound by a physical space, right? So maybe folks think of community as like, me back home with my tribe, right? Or, everyone that's in our office space or everyone that's at our school. But the really kind of broader idea here is that we we are all a community, whether we're in the same physical space or not, right? So how can we actually, again, hold space and move this work forward, that'll benefit everyone, right? That can focus on everyone healing, right? Because it's literally, we talked about trauma being in the systems and the structures of our society. So like healing needs to be everywhere as well, right? We can't just have these little pockets of healing here and there. So like I said earlier, foundations of healing work are throughout Black feminist praxis, right? And so thinking about Bell Hooks, like amazing quote says, when we choose to heal, we are choosing liberation, right? So a lot of times, again, thinking about trauma and responding to trauma, it's very individual interventions or going through a trauma workbook or, tapping, recognizing all the triggers and everything else, right? but what would it mean to center healing through centering collective liberation, right? Um, so this is this is social justice. Thinking about Black liberation, Indigenous sovereignty. So there's this term that I came across in the literature talking about survivance, right? And so this to me is like fundamentally an embodiment of centering liberation, right? So they're saying it demonstrates this like continued Native presence and vitality in the face of colonialism and historical trauma, right? So instead of saying like, I hate whenever folks talk about like, oh, the genocide of Indigenous peoples as like it like is a completed thing or something, because I'm like, we're still here, we're still very much here. I would say like attempted genocide maybe, but thinking about survivance, like that really focuses on our like resilience as Indigenous people rather than seeing us as like victims of colonialism, right? And it's the same thing with how we talk about individual folks who have experienced trauma, right? You don't call them victims, you call them survivors, right? So thinking about survivance, that can be applied across communities, really to Native folks and non-Natives, to really think about how we can facilitate this mutual understanding of what decolonial work would actually look like, right? And how we can build solidarity across our communities, right? So I like to talk about bliss, Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. Um, Yay, I don't know what the other S is for, but bliss. So thinking about, there's a lot more in common that we have across our communities than we don't. And so thinking about how can we center our collective liberation as a means of healing, right? Thinking about the coloniality of knowledge specifically, healing from trauma draws from these multiple forms of knowing and being, right? And so this is again for me, it's a direct connection of decolonization, because it's like, if we start valuing our community knowledge, our traditional knowledge, right, of our elders and community members, if we reject the written word over everything, right? Um, so just because it's written down doesn't mean that it has more or less privilege, right? Using critical consciousness as a tool to actually see and evaluate these sorts of things, right? To eliminate these hierarchies and value this sort of everyday discourse, right? How can we reclaim that knowledge that's been kind of discarded throughout time? How can we really embrace those different ways of knowing and being without trying to fit them within a Western framework, right? To validate them. So there's ways to do this throughout research that folks have put forward, like testimonials, two-eyed seeing, using storytelling as an approach, right? And so even just all of the the ideas that we've started our time with, thinking about what do we count as trauma? How do we measure trauma? What do we include in it? That has already been an exercise in decolonizing knowledge. So we're already on a good path together. And thinking about just overall rejecting pathology, I'm always going to take a swing at the DSM if I have time. So thinking about how understanding our world through this colonial mindset frames our understanding of trauma, right? So as social workers specifically, we're taught about trauma within a very specific, diagnostic criteria, post-traumatic stress disorder. This entire, you know, diagnosis system, our entire healthcare system, is built on this Western medical model that perpetuates deficit approaches, right? What brings you in today? What are the symptoms? What's wrong? But we never think about sort of a holistic perspective of healing or of wellness or well-being, right? So if we do consider community perspectives of trauma, Southern Indigenous scholars have talked about a soul loss. Dr. Duran has talked about a soul wound or healing a soul wound, which are both directly tied to experiences of colonialism, right? And so thinking that, that can be passed generationally, so that would count as generational trauma. It's experienced at a collective level, so it could be collective trauma or cultural trauma. It also could be historical trauma, but all of the definitions and things, it's still trying to put them all in a box, measure them, and that's where it is, right? And so rejecting that pathology of this is trauma and this is not, right? Like expanding our inclusion and being more expansive in how we're even thinking about what counts as trauma, what is a trauma, how are we seeing it, how are we responding to it, right? Requires us to reject this pathology. And ultimately, just this idea of collective action, right? We can't, will away these great social ills of our time. And so again, like I've been talking about throughout, we really need this collective approach, right? It's really, like I said, everybody has been impacted by colonialism and white supremacy. So it's going to take everybody, it's going to take a collective movement of folks to disrupt these structures at a systemic level, right? So in nowhere in here did I say like, you know, I've been talking throughout about how society is structured in a way that perpetuates trauma. And so I'm not saying let's all learn this individual trauma intervention to address systemic trauma, right? Like it's not in there. We need to disrupt the structures, right? That takes collective action, that takes organizing, that takes contributing to your local communities, right? Doing something, right? So, so just wrapping up, thinking about what the heck did you just talk about? Where do we go from here, right? Just takeaway moments for you all today. Trauma fundamentally is an issue of equity and human rights. We have to address coloniality and structural racism that's embedded within racial trauma. And ultimately, the invitation for today is to think about how we can create a space for healing, not just in a way to repair what's lost or broken, but to really create a culture shift in how we think about collective healing, how we account for and address racial trauma, how we can make better systems and communities where we live and work and breathe and do all of these wonderful things. So Niash, thank you so much. I'm gonna leave this up for a second and drink my coffee, and then we will do Q&A. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see y'all in the chat. Hi, friends. Okay, great. So who wants to start with a question? Yeah, go for it.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. BlackDeer. It's an honor and privilege to hear you speak. I've been following you on Twitter. So just my question for you is, in what ways have your own understandings, knowledge of trauma, of decoloniality changed? Especially within your doctoral program, thinking about when you first started out as an undergrad to now being on the other side. And so just what has changed, what hasn't changed for you? That's my question.
Yeah, well, it's great to meet you. Thanks so much for being here. Yeah, I think it's definitely changed. So my undergrad was in psychology, and so it's like super, developmental Western psych, all of these sort of really stages and finite ways of knowing. And so for me, trauma initially started out very this individualized approach. This one instance happens to you, and then you're just supposed to figure out your way to recover from there, right? And I think even just the idea of recovery, it just is a very individual kind of like that's your own thing, and so for me, I've really, as I've gone through thinking about embodying decolonial scholarship and really applying that to things, it's kind of like turning it back around of like, no, this isn't it, right? Like what you're talking about for trauma is not just this like one instance, right? And so I do work within the realm of like sexual violence or gender-based violence. And so a lot of times, right, even working with trauma survivors, like sexual violence survivors, they're like, oh my gosh, like it's not just a stranger jumping out of the bushes, right? It can be someone you know or someone you kind of, and it's like, I kind of had this similar experience with thinking about trauma because I'm like, it doesn't have to be this one, like someone jumps out of the bushes and whacks you over the head, right? It can be this very like, I really loved seeing that one term of insidious trauma, because they were like, it's small and you don't really see it. And like, but it's those are the things that like wear you down over time, right? And so how can we then, so then the entire discourse around trauma is focused on like, how do we address this one instance? How do you get to address those triggers or those, activating whatever? And it's like, it's everything, right? Like, I need y'all to address these systems that are perpetuating trauma, not just these one instances, So I think my perspective has definitely, been more expansive of thinking about y'all. Like, that's why I'm like, I want y'all to see that this is a structural thing, so we can all work collectively to address these like traumatizing structures, rather than just like continuing to tell us like, oh, you should do an intervention and work on that yourself. So yeah. Shari.
Hi, Autumn. Good to see your lovely face.
Yeah, this is good to see you.
I have a question. Let me first thank you for that. I always try to thank folks when we're pouring our souls into some work. So thank you for expelling that energy. And I hope at the end, you can replenish. It's
Oh,
not,
thank you.
it's a lot to the word work. I often struggle with, right? Because
Yeah.
it's personal and soul work. So thank you. But my second question, I hadn't told you this yet, but I was just talking to Philomena that I just got a Springer publisher contract.
Yes,
So,
you do.
they're not ready. They're not ready. But
Oh God.
the beginning conversation that I'm having with the other authors is, how are we going to define and have conversations around why we are not going to say DEI in social work? Like, we need to stop with that. So I heard you say that. But now myself and the other authors are trying to find literature or authors, maybe yourself, to help us distinguish between and have shared language around colonization and colonialism, right? So a lot of times I think people are using those words interchangeably. I heard you, it sounded like you were specific around which word. Can you first give a little bit about how they're different and connected, and then lead me, perhaps other folks, into some folks who've done more work on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the movement has been to kind of shift away from using colonialism, because it invokes these notions of like it was in the past, or it was only for whatever specific group folks are familiar with, right? And so a lot of folks really don't even consider how colonialism has impacted them beyond, Black and Native communities, right? And it's like, not true. Like, y'all have a lot of work to do. So thinking about coloniality, that is really the language that I've been moving towards, because I feel like it helps folks see that this is like right here, right now, right? It's like, this is what's going on. And so there is folks predominantly from the global South, I would say, that have like Nelson Maldonado Torres, Jairo Funes, I'm blanking on his name right now. I think his last name is Barrio. I can send you a list for sure. But and there's also a good recorded webinar too, if you just want to nerd out straight into coloniality of knowing, being, and power. Like, those are because there's even more, like folks have even expanded them now to think about like the coloniality of nature and how that impacts climate justice. So it's just overall the colonial matrix of power, I think, is really where folks are at. And there's different arms, and there's a great graphic on Twitter where it's like a Hydra head or something, like it's got all these little monster heads and stuff, and each one is a different arm of it. And so I think that's been really helpful for me to understand that it's here and now and ongoing, and it kind of accounts for both the historic parts of colonialism, right? Like the Eurocentricity and how these things got set up, but also to help us see like white supremacy today and racial capitalism and all of these things, all of our more easily visible, I think, current issues.
Perfect.
I can send you an email.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. Again, great job. Thank you, Autumn.
Thank you so much. Maureen?
Hi, thank you so much. This was a really great learning for me, and I may be approaching it a little bit differently because I'm not a social worker, I'm a community health worker. But my question is, in some of my work with community members, we do a lot of talking about power and resiliency, and how there's a power in not what people have been through, but in that heroic choice to heal from it and to do that work. But I guess I wanted to ask your opinion on kind of that fine line between acknowledging the power of resiliency without wanting to normalize the fact that we live in structures that force people to be resilient and like that just keep throwing so much stuff at people. So I wondered if there was something in, decolonial thought that focused on that kind of that designation, or if you had just any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good point. I always try to be careful about even talking about resilience, right? Because it's like, I think really just in connecting it to being, a decolonial scholar, it's really that, like, again, back to holding space. And so I never want to push the idea of resilience on folks, because it almost, like for Indigenous communities, there's this great brand or organization called Reclaim Your Power. And one of their like trademark things is strong, resilient, Indigenous. And I saw a great post the other day that was like, what if we were soft and resilient, or like, and I was like, I love that, right? Like thinking about, we don't have to be so like, like resilience is almost this kind of like, oh, like I've been resilient, I've been through it, and it's like, what if we held space for us to, be soft on our healing journey, or maybe, or to be the total opposite as well. Like I've been talking about throwing bricks the entire time. Like that also could be resilience, like I'm all for like, flipping a table or doing those sorts of things as well. So, I mean, I really think just being as expansive as possible for however folks want to, embrace or respond to their healing. So for some, it's going to be like, I am resilient. Yeah, like that feels good for me. And other folks are like, maybe it's more resistance or survivance, something like that. So it really just depends, I think, on just affirming that whatever folks have done to get here, like they're doing the dang thing, Yeah, great to have you. Nancy?
Hi, thank you so much for everything you've talked about today, and I love following you on Twitter. So I just say that. So I'm not sure this is a fair question to even ask you because you're an assistant professor. Okay, so I want to say that, but I really struggle with the academy and with how to support faculty coming through the academy who are decolonizing knowledge, right? Who are really working on coming with different frameworks about knowledge in a structure that was built in medieval times, that's, racial capitalism. I mean, just trying to both advocate for people, but the reality is, and try to educate folks, but the reality is we're trying to do it within this crazy structure. And I don't, if you have any thoughts about somebody I could read or someplace that would be helpful to me and towards helping people navigate that, trying to create the space for people to be there to do their work here, as opposed to the work that's been defined, by the European sort of colonization of knowledge, I would be grateful for that. And I recognize this is going to be a path that you're trying to walk yourself. That's why I say, I know it may not be fair, but you may have seen some things that you think can be helpful for those of us who are trying to create space in the academy, and to change the structures here, right? With which is daunting.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of great work by Indigenous scholars that have gone through the academy, or just even Black and Brown folks. I just recently read Community as Resistance. Is that by Dr. Pena, I think? We're just talking about folks who have, carved their own path through the academy, I think has been really beneficial for me. I don't have my phone. I screenshot this one book that someone shared on Twitter about like the university as like a third place or something. And so thinking about just expanding what counts as the university. Thank you so much for putting that in the chat. But I think, you know, we've been having conversations about revising our promotion and tenure process. And I was like, let's be more expansive. Like, why instead of making like a less toxic version of this, we could just like, instead of like, you know, it's a square and they want to make it like a smaller square so it's less harmful. And I'm like, what if it was a circle? And they were like, maybe next year we can talk about that. And I was like, cool. So I don't know, you know, like I have hope that, you know, folks are at least, you know, I found a place that is actually open to the idea of that. Yeah, like Katie said in the chat, cluster hires. Yeah, I came in with 2 other folks and it's been so amazing to have other folks with me. But I think even, you know, working within the institution, I always say like we have to carve out our smaller spaces while working for bigger change as well. And so, you know, having the short-term goals and things that we can do and support, but then also the longer term things of like folks that can speak the admin language and talk to the provost and everybody else, because like that is not my ministry. So we all have, you know, that's why we need a community, because everybody has their different superpowers, and that's not mine.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And with that, we are past time, so we will have to let you all go. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. BlackDeer, for sharing with us, for your knowledge and doing the work that you do. See you all again soon, I hope.